All right, here we are on section 1.4, and we're going to talk about solving absolute value equations. So, quick absolute value refresher. We talked about it before. Remember, absolute value is distance from zero. So, distance from zero, distance is always positive. Again, there's nothing out front here. The absolute value of a negative number comes out is the same as the absolute value of a positive number, assuming there's nothing else there, like nothing else out front. If I want to multiply, if I multiply two numbers inside an absolute value, that's the same as having each one in their own absolute value. Same thing goes for division. But the important thing and what we're talking about and what's new for us today is solving absolute value equations. So if I have the absolute value of some sort of expression inside an absolute value equal to a number, equal to C, then what you do is you write two equations. One of them, notice everything in here stays the same, equal to C, and one of them equal to the opposite of C. And then you solve both of those equations. Okay, so here we go. If I have the absolute value of x minus 4 equals 6, you write two equations. X minus 4 equals 6. X minus 4 equals negative 6. The x minus 4 parts don't change. You just change the sign on both of those, what it's equal to. Keep the same number, just change the sign. Solve it out, do the math. And, excuse me, I don't know why I said that. To prove to you that I'm not a liar, I'll do this once, I'm not gonna do it every time, but we're gonna check this answer. Look, if I take 10 and I plug it back into the original equation, 10 minus 4 is 6. Does the absolute value of 6 equal 6? Yes, it does. Plug negative 2 in. Remember, when you're checking this, I'm checking it with the original equation. Don't use the negative, use the original problem. Negative 2 minus 4 is negative 6. Is the absolute value of negative 6 positive 6? Yes, it is. Two solutions. There'll be a couple of tricky ones that don't have two solutions. We'll talk about those tomorrow. But for the most part, everything today, two solutions. So, one more time so you can see it again. All right, good enough. Equation. Absolute value of 3x plus 1 equals negative 5. Now, if you were reading carefully on the previous screen, it says when C is less than 0, so when C is negative, the absolute value has no solution. Has no solution. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, if I have an absolute value equal to a negative, we said in the beginning, an absolute value is positive. An absolute value is greater than 0. So if I have an equation where the absolute value equals negative 0, negative 5, that's it. You're done. No solution. An absolute value cannot equal a negative number. All right? So, practice a couple of these. For some reason, these really simple ones are a little tricky. So, you just have x equals 10, x equals negative 10. Follow the same rules. Take what's in the absolute value, set it equal to one of each. All right? So, set this one up. Absolute value equal to the number, absolute value equal to the opposite, and solve both equations. Solve the equation. Set each one up, solve the equation. Notice the inside the parentheses stuff does not change. Number 3, absolute value equal to a negative. One thing on graphing. If it asks you to graph and you have to graph, if it gives you a number line, these are just points on a number line. So you just put dots, 1 at 10, one at negative 10. Just put a dot. That's all you gotta do. If it asks you to graph, they're just points. There's no shading or anything. We'll get into some inequalities in the next chapter. No shading or anything right now. So, next. What if there's stuff outside the absolute value? So, some of you are excitedly looking at this problem and you go, but Mr. Stevens, it's equal to a negative number. Slow your roll. You've got to deal with all the stuff outside the absolute value first. You've got to isolate the absolute value before you can make that judgment. So, the first thing I need to do is isolate the absolute value. So, I get that. Now, is the absolute value equal to a positive? Yeah, now it's equal to a positive, so I can continue. Now, I break it into two equations. Do not separate into two equations until you have the absolute value isolated. You've got to deal with anything outside the absolute value first before you go splitting it into two equations. So now I would write, let me get a different color here. Now I'm set up. Two equations to solve. It's going to take 2 steps to do it. Got to keep it color coordinated. Two answers. I can plug it back in if I wanted to. I'm not going to take time to do that now. Check me if you want. All right, so again, deal with the stuff outside the absolute value first, then split your equations into two. Next, I believe we've got, yes, a word problem. So zoom in if you need to, but this says, in a cheerleading competition, the minimum length of the routine is 4 minutes, the maximum length of the routine is 5 minutes. Write an absolute value equation that represents the minimum and maximum lengths. So, initially, I want you to think about this as on a timeline, right? So if we think about this, the minimum is 4 minutes, the maximum is 5 minutes. So if I'm doing a cheer routine, I've got to be somewhere in between that interval. Well, here's how you do this and work backwards to find an equation. What you need to do is you need to figure out what is that midpoint of your interval. So in this case, halfway between 4 and 5 would be 4.5. And then, how far is it from the middle to your endpoints? So in this case, it is 0.5 each way. If you remember back to what we talked about, absolute value is distance from 0, right? That was our original definition of absolute value. So the distance in this case is what I'm equal to. Now, I'm not going distance from 0 here because I've got an interval between 4 and 5. So I do distance from the midpoint. That's my equation. Why did I write minus 4.5? That's a long, complicated conversation that's hard to do over a video. So maybe if you're in person, I can explain it a little bit. All you need to do mechanically for right now, use the opposite sign. So if for whatever reason you would have an interval on the negative side, you would put a plus here. Most of ours are going to be talking real life stuff, so they'll be positive. So you'd write minus. So there's our equation. That's it. So 4.5 represents the middle of my interval. 0.5 is the distance to the endpoints, okay? How much room do you have from the middle? Notice neither of these numbers are actually in the word problem. So you can't just use the numbers from the word problem and write an equation, okay? Gotta actually think and work some mechanics out here. So, this is gonna come up in your homework. Make sure you understand how you can write these equations. Come back to this video if you need to. Let's do a couple more examples. Let's go to number 5. So, I told you if there's stuff outside the absolute value, you got to deal with that first. You got to isolate that absolute value. Well, I can't distribute. That's not allowed. It's not a parentheses. It's an absolute value. But to isolate this, a number next to an absolute value means multiplication. So I can divide. 4 divided by 4 is 1. So now I have my absolute value isolated. Now I can split it into 2 equations. Solve. I'm going to skip a couple steps here. Subtract 7, or I'm not going to show you. I'll do them. Divide. Subtract 7. Divide. As far as fractions and decimal goes, I prefer fractions. I know some of you prefer decimals. You could write 11 over 2. You could write 5.5 negatives. Either, I'll take it all. So, isolate your absolute value. Here I would have to subtract 5 from both sides before I get started. Here I got 2 steps to get that absolute value isolated. I would have to add 3 to both sides, and then, just like we did down here, divide by -2 on both sides. Then my absolute value would be isolated, and I could solve the resulting equation. All right? I do want to take a quick look at this one more word problem, do one more word problem for you. So, poetry contest. Minimum length of this poem is 16, maximum length is 32. Write an absolute value equation. So, again, we are going from 16 to 32. That's my interval. Find the middle. What is the middle between 16 and 32? That's 24. That tells me I am 8 away here and 8 away here. So I'm in the middle. So again, I write my absolute value. The distance is what I'm equal to. Distance from what? Distance from 24. That's how you write an absolute value equation. All right, we're going to talk about absolute value equations one more day. We're going to spend 2 days on this. So try to keep up and hit me up if you got questions.